again to my show, Searching for Integrity. My name really is John Smith, and I'm searching for people with integrity. Why? Because our country suffers from IDD, integrity deficit disorder. Today, we have a variety of news articles to discuss, mostly discussions regarding if we are in a recession or not. My name again, John Smith, and I'm the I'm the author of my book, Embracing the Abyss. And I'm going to begin with the first article. The U.S. economy shrank for a second consecutive quarter, according to Thursday's Gross National Product, GDP, report, suggesting that the nation may be heading into a recession. The latest Commerce Department data shows that GDP declined for a second time this year at a 0.9% annualized pace from April through June. The year's first quarter showed a GDP decline of 1.6%. Two negative GDP quarters in a row are commonly, but not officially, used to define a recession. Opinions differ on how long a recession could last, given that an economic downturn depends on several factors, but experts agree that public concern over inflation is warranted, even if a recession hasn't been declared yet by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, the official arbiter. Because NBER's definition of recession involves more factors than just two consecutive quarters of GDP contraction, the call won't come for at least a few months. That said, economists say the troubling state of the economy is not lost on the everyday person, who is likely feeling the effects of rising inflation, less than optimal job prospects, and steep interest rates. Arthur Laffer, an economic advisor to Ronald Reagan for both of his residential terms, is predicting that the earliest turnaround for the economy will be 5 years. He told Newsweek that this timeline depends on what he sees as two key events: that the GOP can flip the House and the Senate in November's midterm elections, and that the party wins the presidency in 2024. He said that a recessionary economy would require at least 2 years of congressional leadership that prioritizes free markets and tax cuts. According to the conservative economic thinking, therefore, an additional year of such policies. If that were the case, January 1, 2027 would be the first time you would actually see a material change in the U.S. economy, said Laffer, who also served as an economic advisor to President Donald Trump during his 2016 presidential campaign. While Laffer laid out detailed timeline for the economic slump, others said there are too many factors up in the air to set a hard deadline. The nation is still dealing with the huge chain, and much of the economic certainty is tied to the duration and outcome of Russia war against Ukraine. In a best case scenario, things could turn around in a matter of moments, according to Joanne Weiner, an economics professor at George Washington University. If the Fed manages to tame inflation through its interest rate increases, while also keeping consumers confident that the economy is not going to tank, then any recession that rises may be short, she said. The 2020 economic contraction lasted just 2 months, she pointed out. If the Fed is successful, Weiner said, the recession could be over before its negative effects make a real impact on the economy. Her predictions echo those of Larry Summers, a top economic advisor to President Barack Obama, who last week said the economy's future will depend on how skillful the Fed turns out to be. Summers has drawn national attention since pointing out the Biden administration's missteps on inflation. Laffer said that while he and his colleagues disagree over the cure for a potential recession, Summers has been extremely good at analyzing and projecting what's happening. I do agree with him verbatim on what has caused this and what damage is done and why it happened, Laffer said. He and I are exactly on the same page with regard to the prognosis. Last Sunday, Summers emphasized to CNN that U.S. needs strong action from the Fed. If we continue with the kind of ostrich policies we had in 2021, there's going to be much, much more pain later, he said. I would assume that we're sticking our head in the sand is where we're being an ostrich. Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who previously served as the director of Congressional Budget Office and a senior economic advisor to George W. Bush, HW, agrees that recession's call would ultimately depend on what the central bank does next on interest rates. This is a classic situation of once you let inflation become entrenched, you have no good choices. You either let people live with inflation where it's clearly politically unsustainable, or you do things to combat inflation and run the risk of a recession. And that's where they are. Despite the recent reports, Holtz-Eakin doesn't believe in the U.S. is in a recession yet because he is still too soon to spot a broad and sustained decline in the economy, which would span more than 2 consecutive quarters. Just because a recession is not here yet, he cautions, that doesn't mean it can't be ruled out altogether. I'm more worried about next year than this year, he said. While the economy may squeak by the second quarter, the next 2 GDP reports could bring solid, unimpressive growth, he predicted. Next year, the impact of Fed tightening will really start to show up, he said. I think that's where the real risk of a recession lies. And that, to an extent, is how many times the Federal Reserve will increase interest rate hikes. The U.S. economy shrank for a second quarter, according to Thursday's gross national product. And we've seen this page. Another article, news that the U.S. has unofficially entered recession spells political danger for Joe Biden, with no Democrat president having been reelected after a recession began in their term of office since Franklin D. Roosevelt. Figures from the Commerce Department released on Thursday showed U.S. gross domestic product fell by an annualized rate of 0.9%. This follows a growth rate of 1.6%. GDP is used to measure all the goods and services produced by a country. While the U.S. isn't in technical recession, on the designation can only be made months later by the National Bureau of Economic Research. The latest figures are a bitter blow for the Democrats ahead of the November midterms. Roosevelt secured re-election in 1940, despite having overseen in the recession of 1937-38 that saw U.S. GDP decline by 18.2%. Wow. America's second worst 20th century recession after the Great Depression. However, no Democrat president has replicated this feat since, with a number losing power after a recession began under their leadership. Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower won the 1952 presidential election after Democrat President Harry Truman oversaw the 1949 recession, which shaved 1.7% off the U.S. GDP. Under Jimmy Carter, the U.S. entered recession for 6 months in January 1980, after which Ronald Reagan won the 1980 presidential election with a landslide. Republican presidents have been far more successful in surviving recessions, with Eisenhower securing re-election in 1956, despite having led America through a recession in 1953 that knocked 2.6% from us GDP. Richard Nixon was re-elected for a second term in 72 after overseeing the relatively mild recession of 69-70, and Ronald Reagan won the 1984 presidential election after overseeing the 1981 and 82 recession, which cost us 2.7% of its GDP, the U.S. Whilst Barack Obama had to contend with the end of the Great Recession in early 2009, this began in 2007 during the presidency of George W. Bush. Another article by Catherine Vung, Biden's recession hits U.S. and GDP shrinks, and White House fights over the data. President Joe Biden may have spent the week trying to persuade Americans that the nation is not in recession, but Thursday's long-awaited gross domestic product, GDP, report showed the economy shrank for a second consecutive quarter. The latest data from the Commerce Department revealed that GDP, which measures the total output of goods and services in the U.S., declined again this year at a 0.9% annualized pace for April through June. The first quarter's decline was 1.6%. Not every recession follows 2 full quarters of negative growth. Saw the U.S. economy shrink on that basis, but without going into a recession. Still, the consecutive quarter contraction is a typical telltale sign that recession is coming and is often used to define one. The official declaration of a recession is made by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, which defines it as a significant decline in economic activity that is across the country and that lasts more than a few months. But the NBER often doesn't make the call until months later. U.S. enters recession in the second quarter by looking at a chart and making a comparison. The technical details of that constitutes a recession are what the Biden administration latched up to efforts to pre-spin Thursday's data. It has strictly adhered to currently unmade call for the NBER and arguing against those who have already declared a recession based on the second quarter GDP decline. And there's that. So we will see more in the future, and we will see what effect the moves made regarding interest expense and interest deductions for them to conclusively agree with what we're saying here. Also in the words today, there is a Senate climate bill. It's a boon for fossil fuels. I'm concerned it's going to be looking at throwing more money out of a helicopter. $360 billion measure has tax incentives to spur clean energy, but also guarantees for oil and gas. Senate Democrats are moving forward on the costliest and most ambitious effort ever by the U.S. to address climate change, powered in part by benefits for fossil fuels, and broader energy industry. The proposed $369 billion compromise struck between Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin includes tax incentives aimed at channeling billions of dollars to wind, solar, and battery developments that put clean power onto the grid. At the insistence of Mr. Manchin, the legislative package provides support for traditional supports of energy like oil, gas, and coal, along with nuclear power. There are tax subsidies for plants that capture the carbon emissions from burning those fossil fuels, and others for producing hydrogen, often done with natural gas. Even expanding offshore wind and solar power development on federal land will now require the federal government to offer more access for drilling on federal territory. That would be an improvement. On Thursday, Mr. Manchin called the deal an all-in energy policy to boost U.S. energy independence. He said the new bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, would keep tame inflation in certain ways, including by spurring domestic energy production that will lower costs. Under the bill, the Interior Department would be required to offer up at least 2 million acres of federal land and 60 million acres of offshore acreage to oil and gas producers every year for the next decade. If Interior officials fall short, tough trade-offs are the only path for getting major climate investments over the finish line. A climate group with ties to the Biden administration and progressives and a major investment package like this is absolutely essential to meeting our climate goals. Personally, I'm not necessarily sold on climate goals, nor are there others that I know of feel the same way. Mr. Manchin, who has coal business ties and represents a big coal and gas state, has said that the U.S. needs to ensure its supply of domestic energy while the renewables industry continues to grow. Many of his allies doubled down on the view after Russia's invasion of Ukraine pushed Western countries to find alternatives to Russian oil and gas. Mr. Manchin also said he wants to keep the U.S. from becoming dependent on China for batteries, other clean energy technologies, and the minerals needed to build them. Putin weaponized energy like no other time I've ever seen, Mr. Manchin told reporters on Thursday. I think Chinese will do the same with rare earth minerals. For the oil industry, the bill would also effectively reinstate an $80 million acre sale for the Gulf of Mexico from last year that a federal judge had invalidated. It was the largest offshore oil and gas lease sale in U.S. history, producing $191 million in bids. Major oil companies such as Chevron, Exxon, and Shell that had bid in the offshore auction could quickly benefit. Some have said that these sales are essential to maintain the U.S. production. Shell chief executive, speaking to reporters, praised the deal and highlighted its promise of new lease sales to come. Shell has been investing in new platforms to boost its Gulf of Mexico operations, and he said oil production there has to go on even amid efforts to address climate change. The world needs new oil and gas to come on stream, he said. Just curtailing domestic supply in the hope that somehow some domestic demand will follow suit. It's not a realistic policy. Toby Rice, chief executive of EQ2 Corp, largest natural gas producer in the U.S., said that was a win for the natural gas industry, saying it would provide an accelerated timeline for building the pipelines and terminals needed to increase production and exports of the fossil fuel. The agreement was yet another proof that governments are adjusting their policies to make it easier for us to bring this energy into the world, he told investors in an earnings call Thursday. In exchange for access to more federal territory, oil and gas companies would also have to pay higher royalty rates for drilling there. It would also require them to pay royalties on methane they burn off or let intentionally escape from their operations on federal lands. Senate Democrats say the more climate-focused provisions of their bill would reduce the country's greenhouse gas emissions 40% by 2030. That would help revive President Biden's long-stalled initiative to cut greenhouse gas emissions 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. If approved by Congress, the bill would be the biggest federal spending package to address climate change. Its nearly $370 billion dwarfs the last similar move, the roughly $90 billion for clean energy in the financial crisis recovery package from more than a decade ago. Independent analysts said the package would go likely far toward accomplishing some of Mr. Biden's goals. The most significant climate provisions are tax credits that would channel billions of dollars to wind, solar, and battery developments that put clean power onto the grid accordingly. The credits could be submitted into law for at least a decade rather than require frequent reauthorizations in Congress under current law, which utilities and developers say will spur more investments more quickly and reduce greenhouse gas emissions years ahead of the current pace. This is more certainly and predictably that the industry has ever been seen by a lot. The bill also aims to reduce emissions with a per-ton tax on major oil and gas producers for leaks of methane from wellheads, pipelines, storage tanks, and other facilities. In November, the Congressional Budget Office evaluated previous similar proposals and estimated that the industry would pay between $1.2 billion and $1.4 billion annually the first 3 years of collection. The American Petroleum Institute, the Oil and Gas Institute trade group, said the bill was some improvements over previous versions, but criticized the proposed tax increases. We oppose policies that increase taxes and discourage investment in oil's natural gas. Many of the other elements of the package attempt to address climate change with programs Mr. Manchin has emphasized they would have fossil fuel producers and expanded subsidy for power plants and other industrial sites that can capture the carbon from the emission is proposed, as well as production tax credit for hydrogen. Subsidies for carbon capture can help keep coal and gas plants alive. And hydrogen is often favored by the oil industry because it can be produced using natural gas and shipping in pipelines that are already built. Some environmental advocates point to evidence that suggests both approaches may be ineffectively at preventing greenhouse emissions. Mr. Manchin said Thursday his vote is also contingent on the passage of permitting reform that would limit review periods to 2 years. He suggests he could help both natural gas pipelines and electric transmission lines for relief. Some scientists and clean energy business advocates have said the country needs more streamlined permitting procedures. It could also expand domestic mining, and Mr. Manchin has advocated for such changes in permitting what he wants. The Center for Biological Diversion, a nonprofit environment, called the measures poison pills, unknown as whether such complaints could derail approval amid the slim majorities Democrats have in Congress, and which they do, and whether or not they will or not exercise that minority. I've given you some good information today, I think, and a better view of the bill itself. I'm just concerned at the size of the bill, and does it cause more inflationary activities in the future? I certainly hope not. Thank you, God, for me, and timing is everything. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in to Searching for Integrity. And so long and happy trails to all. John Smith signing off. Adios.